But first, my New Year's resolution was to try even harder to praise the Albanese government for what it does do right. And I do tonight have an example, but gee, it's been hard looking for them. You know, I thought the Prime Minister would use this Christmas break to have a big think about how he and his team stuffed it up so badly that they ended the year around 50-50 with the Liberals in the polls, blowing a massive lead. But Anthony Albanese rushed back early last week to give a weird press conference that shows he's learned almost nothing, and he won't change much either. For instance, you'd have thought Albanese had learned that voters had reckoned he had not been spending enough time in the office working on fixing their problems. Instead, at the tennis, midnight oil concert, on another plane overseas to be flattered as a handsome boy or whatever. Yet incredibly, this is how Albanese started his first big press conference of this make or break year.
I am very positive as we enter the new year, and later this morning I will be attending briefly the beginning of Davey Warner's last test match at the SCG.
Seriously, attention Australia, I'm off to the cricket. Well, at least he said briefly, although he actually went twice to that test. Another thing I thought he'd learn after losing the referendum on the voice last year, his big plan for an Aboriginal-only advisory parliament, after 60% of Australians voted no to dividing us by race. But no, look at the placement of the flags during that press conference, at least for our cameras. 2 race flags, the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander ones, right behind him, and the Australian one hidden to the right of the screen. Now, if Albanese spent his break working on a new agenda for this year, it sure hasn't showed yet. Instead of that press conference listed the things it said he'd done to make life easier for voters, like you should in fact be grateful already. And Treasurer Jim Chalmers today tried exactly that same trick. I mean, guess what he said? You know, my Treasury experts have just worked out that wages have not risen this fast in 15 years. Just forget that prices have risen even faster.
Overall, wages are growing again in our economy. That's a good thing after a decade of deliberate wage stagnation.
There's been something else that made me think, has this Prime Minister learned nothing? You know, these leftist ideological frolics of this government, they should have been dropped, like treating our history as an embarrassment, weakening our national identity, bringing in record numbers of immigrants, flying 3 flags, letting 80 local councils scrap celebrations of Australia Day this month, as if the day is one of shame. And the thing is, of course, it has a consequence. Now, when the very idea of patriotism is a joke to our elites, many leftists rather fighting for a Palestinian nation than our own, well, guess what? We don't have enough young Australians wanting to sign up to defend our country, sign up for our army or our navy or air force. Yet this Albanese government, instead of saying, hey, we better restore patriotism, we better build a national spirit, offer more respect and rewards to Australians in uniform, it decides, nah, let's just hire some foreigners to fight for us. Pacific Islanders, for instance, that'd be excellent mercenaries. Here is the Minister for Defence Personnel, Matt Keogh.
We are certainly looking at all options that we need to look at in terms of how we can grow our defence force, and that includes looking at how we might be able to grow it from friendly forces from other countries. Certainly we're looking at the Pacific.
The Prime Minister was asked about this shameful idea of hiring mercenaries to defend us. Instead of stepping up as the leader, the man ultimately overseeing our military, he just palmed off the issue to his deputy.
Matt Keogh this morning was talking about the possibility of foreigners from friendly nations, Five Eyes nations, Pacific nations, serving in the Australian Defence Force. Would that be something you'd be open to?
Sorry, that's a matter for Richard Marles to deal with.
If this Prime Minister can't even decide who should actually defend his country and why, get some foreigners just doing it for the cash, he should quit now. But speaking of quitting, the big thing Albanese should have done over the break, halfway through his term, is replace some of the big failures in his government. Get in some fresh talent from the backbench. Most obviously, of course, get rid of Indigenous Australians Minister Linda Burney. Get her to resign because she said she had bad health anyway. And she was completely hopeless at selling the voice, couldn't answer any questions without reading cheat sheets. And now that the voice is dead, ask, has Bernie come up with a single fresh idea, for instance, to tackle the violence that's now exploded again in Alice Springs and Wadair? And here's another minister who should have at least been shuffled sideways. Climate Change Minister, Energy Minister Chris Bowen, who has since been, well, it's been for years now, blindly leading a religious crusade to shut down our coal-fired power stations and switch us to renewables like wind and solar instead. Just last Friday, there was Bowen tweeting again about how great Britain was doing with wind power, forgetting to add that people there have had to pay even more for their electricity. And I was thinking of Bowen last week, you see, when I was driving halfway across Victoria on a road trip with my daughter through areas that today face flood warnings. I couldn't believe even then how green the state was. So green in January, when the Bureau of Meteorology had warned us in September that the La Nina would dry up the rains. When global warming guru Tim Flannery, hired by the Gillard Labor government as our climate commissioner, told us in 2007 that global warming would actually mean less water.
Even the rain that falls isn't actually going to fill our dams and our river system.
But what really got me about Bowen as I was driving there through the country was that so many wind farms, you can see them now, left, right, are built on hills and rises, turning our magnificent countryside, get away from it all, into a wind farm industrial zone. And you get the same thing in South Australia, in Tasmania too, everywhere, New South Wales, West Australia, and even near the rainforests of Queensland. How can we vandalise our countryside like this? But the worst of it is that under Bowen's global warming plans, we're going to need about 9 times more wind farms by 2050 than we have even today. Every wind tower you see, multiply them. Imagine 9 more on the hills around you. But I said to praise one Albanese government minister, and let me end with this. Environment Minister Tanya Plibersek. She has said no today to a plan to build a huge new facility to build offshore wind farms. She said it would hurt wetlands in the area, and it sure would. I would know, because the site of this planned monstrosity is in Hastings, on Victoria's Western Port Bay. I live not far from that. And the thought of our quiet bay, Phillip Island on it as well, being turned into another green industrial zone for extremes like Bowen, give me a break. In fact, there are extra points to Plibersek because this wind farm facility was wanted by a wind farm company called Star of the South. That is 10% owned by the Cbus Union Super Fund. And who's chairman of that? Labor President and former Treasurer Wayne Swan. But his of Labor's right, Plibersek is of Labor's left. I think there's going to be some hard words behind the scenes. And of course, this means Bowen's rollout of wind farms and solar farms, is of the right too, is now in even more trouble. It's so far behind already, it's a joke. If only the Prime Minister replaced Chris Bowen with someone less manic and less obsessed with global warming, what a great start to the year that would have been. But as it is, stand by. We've got some fighting to do.